Hello everyone, my name is Rayce Lamb. I am a lay leader here at Wake Forest Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I just want to thank you for taking some of your time and spending it with us today. Your presence is always welcome, no exception. Today, we are continuing our stewardship series titled, Will the Circle Be Unbroken? Last week on All Saints Sunday, we remembered our ancestral voices, the people who made our church a church of fiery resilience, Christ-centered justice, and radical love. Today, we take a look inward at our own stories and how our faith can be a response to a community, to a city, to a world that is in desperate need of such a faith-driven response. As we travel through the stewardship series, we are doing something a little odd, exploring the Old Testament book of Daniel. It's not often that Daniel is used as part of a stewardship series. And to be honest, it's because this book irks a lot of pastors with its grand acts of faith. Like, do we really need to be willing to be thrown into a lion's den to prove our dedication to God? Or, like today's story, do we really need to be willing to be burned alive in order to have the same faith as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Well, before we get there, let's place today's story into the larger context of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 1, the scene is set. We read that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon comes to Jerusalem and besieges it. King Nebuchadnezzar then sought out Israelites of the royal family who, as chapter 1, verse 4 tells us, were, and I quote, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace, end quote. And lo and behold, who comes onto the scene? Our boy Daniel and his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, those names may not seem familiar to you because we know them by other names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You see, in order to serve in the king's court, new names were placed upon them in order to purge the king's court of any names that referenced the Hebrew God. Then the magic starts to happen. First, in chapter 1, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to partake in the king's food and wine rations in preference of vegetables and water. As someone who's not the biggest fan of vegetables and a big fan of a good Cabernet or a smooth Pinot Noir, I can't say that I would have been as faithful. And we are just in chapter 1. In chapter 2, Daniel begins to interpret dreams, calling on the God of his ancestors, as we read last week, to grant him that wisdom. The king recognizes Daniel's worth, and he and his friends are promoted. And then we begin chapter 3. The introduction to today's text, and read that King Nebuchadnezzar has constructed a golden statue and made a decree to all the land. Chapter 3, verses 4 through 6 reads, "The herald proclaimed aloud that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the harp, the drum, and the entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the gold statue, and whoever doesn't shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire." As you can guess, we witness another great act of faith, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't follow those orders. We read that when King Nebuchadnezzar finds out, he grows furious and orders the men bound and to be thrown into the fire. The Bible even tells us that this fire was so hot that the men ordered to bound and throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire perished themselves from the blazing flames. Yet in today's text, we read how the story ends. An astonished king, 3 unburnt men, and another professional promotion. Oh, what are we to do with today's text? Let's forget how Daniel is strangely absent. We'll get to him next week. I really want to focus on who Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were. If we go back to chapter 1 of the book of Daniel, we know that they were extremely privileged. They were young, without physical defect, handsome, versed in wisdom, and endowed with knowledge that only nobility could have. We also know their culture and heritage was stripped away from them as they were renamed in order to not offend the royal court. And unfortunately, their renaming is how we have remembered them in history. They were privileged, yet they had their culture and heritage stripped away from them, but they still had this unique opportunity to not only serve, but have a voice in the halls of power. Just like these men, each of us are privileged in some way. Some of us have economic privilege. Some of us are privileged because of our skin color, our gender or sexual identity. Some of us have educational and or occupational privilege. And all of us are privileged because we are Americans of the Christian faith. Not to mention, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we are young, even if just in spirit, and quite handsome, right? I also wonder how many of us, despite our privileges, have had to give up a part of who we are, a part of our culture or heritage in order to fit in. A good example of this for me is when I went off to college. My freshman roommate, the son of a lobbyist in Richmond, was the first one to tell me, "Oh, you'll never be able to run for public office because of your thick accent. No one would ever vote for you." The director of the campus radio station was the second to tell me, "We need to work on your accent so people can understand you when you're on the air." And my Spanish professor was the one who hammered the nail into the coffin. "Oh, you'll never be able to be fluent in a foreign language until you learn how to speak English correctly. So you shouldn't be considering studying abroad in Argentina. Rather, you should study abroad in a proper English-speaking country." So that's what I did. 6 months in New Zealand, and my thick Appalachian accent slowly faded away, lost, just for me to fit in. That's my story. But what's yours? Perhaps you are a woman who had to learn how to be a professional in a man's world. Perhaps you've had to code switch, act white in certain spaces, act more masculine in certain spaces, act more straight in certain spaces. And perhaps that is why you have found welcome and belonging in this church. Because here, you just kind of get to be. So like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we are privileged. And many of us, if not all of us, have had to sacrifice a part of our cultural upbringing or heritage just to fit in. But we are also positioned with a unique opportunity to have a voice and to hold those in power accountable. Historically, this congregation has had its fair share of fiery furnace experiences that did not just test our faith, but tested the power structures we were in affiliation with. From our separation from the Southern Baptist Convention to our firm support of the first same-gendered wedding in Waite Chapel, we've, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, have been able to recognize our privilege, name the injustice, and use our place within the power structure to challenge it. But truthfully, none of this could have happened if it wasn't for the financial stability of our church. There's a reason so much inequity exists in our society. People without financial resources are often the ones who are victims of the systems of power they belong to. This is why, for a justice and Christ-centered church, it is so important for us to become and remain fiscally sustainable. That sustainability helps us to lean into our faith without worrying about certain outcomes that may be. When we removed our Southern Baptist affiliation, we lost resources, but we were okay because we were a self-sustaining congregation. Even though we were thrown into the flames, we forced the Southern Baptist Convention and their beliefs that women could not be in leadership and LGBTQ folks were not sacred creations of God to look at us and be amazed that we were not still just alive, but we were unburned. So here I am, as a lay leader of this congregation, asking for your support. We need money to keep our mission alive. And if you're not in a position to give, then we ask, how can you help subsidize cost? Can you aid in worship? Can you offer your talents? Can you invite someone to church? Can you share our post on social media? What the world needs now is a progressive, justice-focused, and Christ-centered church with the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because it is going to take such a faith-centered response to radically transform the world we are witnessing outside of our walls. We can be that voice of peace, that voice of formation, that voice of transformation. We can look at our society that is plagued with racism, health inequity, political polarizations, and bring the love and sacred reconciliation of Jesus to that. And we can help shape our church to be sustainable so that when we are thrown into the next fiery furnace, because we will be one day, we will know that it's all going to be okay. Amen.